In this module, we are going to discuss a few risk scenarios. Let's start with the first task of loading the geyser into a vehicle. To load a geyser into a vehicle may seem like a general task without any risks, but on closer inspection, we can see that we will need to manually handle the geyser. This means that a person must lift, carry, and load the geyser into a vehicle. Depending on where the geyser is stored, this could be over a few meters from the vehicle. The weight of the geyser and the width of the walking path to the vehicle may introduce certain obstructions that could injure a person. If a buddy system, more than one person carrying, is used, who guides the person who may be facing the opposite direction to the path? Is it possible to carry the geyser and walk facing forward? As you can see, the more we dissect the task, the more we can see the potential for risk. What about the packaging of the geyser? Is it in a box? Is it wrapped in plastic? Either way, understanding how to grip the geyser or packaging must also be identified. Why? Because even though it seems like an insignificant detail, if there is not enough grip on the item being carried, it could slip out the hand and cause injury as well as damage to the property. You may automatically be thinking, well, I'll just use gloves. And yes, you are thinking along the right lines. We always want to consider the use of correct PPE when manually handling objects. But is there a better way? Well, engineering has designed straps that makes it easy to lift, handle, and manually transport. These straps are reusable and can last a very long time if used and cared for correctly. And yes, PPE should still be worn, even if engineer type risk mitigation is found. Let us now think of the path to the vehicle. Are there stairs, narrow entranceways, or potential obstructions to loading? A quick walk in the area will determine if you may have the potential for bumping, slipping, or tripping hazards along the way. Be sure to take note of the lighting in the area and pathway. If you cannot see where you're going, you cannot identify any risks. The lifting and lowering and carrying of the geyser can also bring with it certain ergonomic related risks, such as overexertion, strains, and sprains. There should always be a correct lifting procedure in place that trains and educates employees on the correct lifting, lowering, and carrying practices to ensure the elimination of ergonomic related dangers. Once loaded into the vehicle, does the geyser get strapped down or secured into place? You may not have to strap it down if it is inside the back of a vehicle and safely within a canopy or cabin, but have you identified the potential for inertia-related risks? This brings us to the next step, traveling to the destination. The definition of inertia means that an object will continue its current motion until some force causes its speed or direction to change. This term inertia is properly understood as shorthand for the principle of inertia as described by Newton in his first law of motion. Well, this basically means that if your tools and equipment are not secured in the back of your vehicle and you suddenly have to brake, the tools and equipment will continue to move forward. Well, now that you have safely loaded the geyser and other tools to perform the work, have you considered the vehicle itself? Generally, the idea of ensuring a vehicle is safe for the roads is left up to the minimum requirements of the traffic legislation. In other words, we say, if the vehicle has a license and is roadworthy, it's fine. Is that the case? We still need to take into consideration the use of the vehicle, the person operating the vehicle, and the road that is being used. All of these areas introduce additional hazards and risks to the overall task of installing the geyser. For instance, the person operating the vehicle must be licensed for that particular type of vehicle. They must obey all road rules and ensure they are driving using best practice skills instead of just operating a vehicle. vehicle itself should have working lights that are kept on even during daytime. This increases the visibility of the vehicle. The tires and brakes, as well as other maintenance items, must be checked to ensure that they are safe to operate during the trip. Items like windscreen wipers are often forgotten until a rainstorm, and then it is identified as old or perished and no longer safe to use. This could cause serious road accidents and fatalities. Remember, we are discussing how the scope of work you perform could harm you, a person outside of your company, or the environment around you. Lifting a geyser may only expose you to a risk, but driving a car can expose many to various risks. So you can see it's not as simple as just saying drive to site. We need to consider the risk. And again, this is part of installing a geyser, because loading the geyser, traveling to the area of destination should form part of the task that you are performing. Let's get to the next one, which is offloading the geyser and tools and equipment on site. Now, much like loading the geyser, the offloading process needs to be managed accordingly. Additional items will include where the equipment and tools will be stored or placed while work is in progress. Do you need areas for stacking and storing? Laydown and even movement need to be considered so that it can be barricaded, cordoned off, so as to prevent others from entering a dangerous area of works. This must be done to ensure that others are not affected by the work you perform while on site. Even private homes must be considered, as often these are left out. Now let's talk about the setting up of the site. When setting up areas for stacking and storage, laydown and even movement, we should ensure that they are barricaded or cordoned off, and this is to prevent others from entering that area of dangerous work. Consideration of where you will get energy, whether electricity or other forms. Will the cable be an obstruction to passers-by? Will it need to be taped down? Do we need signage for the works to be performed? And will additional access or egress systems need to be in place? Access and egressing a worksite is of vital importance. Perhaps you need to set up a ladder to access an area for installation. In this case, there are new risks associated with setting up the use of a ladder. Please ensure that you adhere to all the requirements of ladder safety as well as ladder best practice. At this step, you are now getting to your quoted works. This is the installation of the geyser. But up to now, we have seen multiple points of hazards and risks that can have a significant impact on the overall task or quoted work of installing a geyser. It can also have a significant impact on the employees, others, and the environment around us. But at this step, you will now need to consider the lifting, holding, fastening, and installation of the actual geyser, the use of hand or power tools, and what hazards and risks these pose to the user of the tools, others in the vicinity, as well as others outside of the vicinity, as well as the environment. Do you need to chop out pieces of the wall or grind it out in order to put piping inside? Well, the use of a grinder in this case will create dust, noise, possibly even sparks depending on what you're using it for. It also creates vibration risks, which is an ergonomic hazard to the operator. And a drill will have similar hazards and risks. All of these items and uses of portable electrical tools need to have their own safe working procedures, as each tool or piece of equipment needed exposes a plumber or the person installing this to various hazards and risks. The tools and other equipment can also endanger persons other than the employee performing the work. We also then need to consider the natural and workplace environment. If a gas canister is needed in order to heat up and solder for piping, then this would create a hot work, where there is a potential for burns as well as fire. Since these have a high potential for significant risk, an additional safety measure may be required, that of issuing a work permit for the task. That means additional precautions will need to be taken to protect everyone and anything from a potential exposure to hotworks. Remember too that if you need to work on a ladder and not just use the ladder for access, then you must consider the risks of working on a ladder and not just using it for access, such as maintaining 3 points of contact and a safe position while working on the ladder, as well as preventing tools from falling to a lower level. If the space is cramped, there could be movement issues. If it's a confined space, then additional precaution and testing may be required. Adequate ventilation, lighting, and sufficient protection is always required, especially when working in a confined space. The geyser will also need to be connected to an energy source, such as electrical, gas, or solar. The question now raised is, what additional hazards and risks does this create? Who is responsible for this? Do you have competence and accreditation to do this? Will you need a subcontractor under you to assist? Or do you hand over the geyser to another contractor? Either way, you must consider what hazards and risks these will pose. A safety file will generally cover all the documentation needed for a site. But remember that a piece of paper cannot save you or keep you safe. The implementation of the procedures, the adherence to legislation, and the monitoring and review of the systems in place is what will give you the best chance of mitigating risk to yourself, to others, as well as the environment around you. If you are qualified to perform the electrical part of the installation of a geyser, then it comes to the next step of testing the geyser after the installation. There are certain factors such as the energy source exposures, leaks that could create slipping and tripping hazards, as well as heated elements that can be dangerous to touch or contact. A person can get burnt, or the heated element could create a potential fire hazard. All of this is necessary to consider before signing off any installation. Now that you have completed the installation, you need to hand over the site, either back to the client or to the individual homeowner. Handing over a site means that you have left it in a state that is the same or better than how you received it. Housekeeping and waste disposal will expose you to hazards and risks that can generate threats to others and the environment. If housekeeping is not performed, slipping, tripping, dust, obstructions, and the like can cause injuries, health effects, and pollution. When handing over a site, we should not consider the job as just done. We need to think of the cleaning process after the task of installing a geyser as part of the job, and therefore an important aspect of the entire installation process. It's also important to consider another step, the education of the client to hazards and risks. Yes, most geysers have signage on it to warn about immediate threats or potential hazards if incorrectly maintained. But what about effects such as scalding, Legionella, and explosion dangers due to incorrect or poor maintenance? Although you are not exposed to these hazards and risks while performing the tasks stated above, these are risks that you are exposing your client and the environment to once you leave their site. Once you've handed the site over, your client is happy and the installation was a success. Is the task over? Well, not really. You now need to travel back to the base of your operations, or perhaps travel to the next site. Now, much like traveling to the installation, the addition of fatigue could be a safety and health risk. How long were you on site? Did you get to eat enough? Did you get to drink enough? To the operator, passenger, other road users, and the environment, this could become a potential risk. So make sure that the safe return of all staff is of paramount importance and also carefully cared for in the safety procedures of your company. Let us now look at scenario number 2, pump room plumbing. A plumber needs to access a pump room located on the second story of a warehouse. The piping to be installed will go from the pump in the pump room to the main water feed on the outside of the exterior wall down to ground level. On the outside of the building, the plumber needs to have access to the exterior wall. This is approximately 3 meters from ground level, and a pipe-sized hole will need to be drilled into the wall to access the pump room and have the pipe running to the feed below. This is a pretty simple task for any plumber, and the risks, plumbing-wise, are reasonably low. That is because the pump is already installed, so all that is needed now is the feed pipe. All the other concerns have already been cared for, overflow, etc. They've already been installed and are working. What the plumber needs to do, though, is just put the piping in for the feed. So what do you need to then know as a plumber? Well, let's go through this exercise. Let's plan for the task and see how to include our safety management and risk mitigation from the start of any project. Step number 1 is identifying the scope of work. Write down what the exact scope of work is. What do we mean by scope of work? Well, this is the exact project details, including the materials, timelines for the actual project, and this will include all items that need to be accomplished in a step-by-step manner. Now, this is different to a method statement, as a method statement explains each step in more detail with added safety aspects. Your scope of work should also include all necessary materials for the safe execution of the project. This could include the use of scaffolding or ladders, as well as any fire prevention or firefighting means if there is hot works, such as welding. Now that you have your scope of work, you need to map out a project plan. This is a methodology, or that method statement of how you're going to do the what that you've said in your scope of work. And as mentioned, this needs to be in more detail. So as an example, you might have a line in your method statement for installation, such as install a 3-meter copper pipe to the exterior of the wall with 2 bends, one for interior connection to the pump room pipe and 1 bend below on ground level to the pipe leading to the feed. Now, this is a good explanation of what you actually need to do in terms of the method for your installation of a pipe feed. However, a safety officer or safety manager wants to know more. They want to know how you are going to do this safely. Now, when explaining your methodology, ask yourself a few things. How are you going to get to the exterior hole drilled where the pump room pipe is located? If a ladder is used, how will it be set up? If a scaffolding is used, how will that be set up? Competencies for both above actions, as well as all certifications, training, and any necessary documentation must go along with the above answers, such as a fall protection plan, a scaffolding plan, a rescue plan, all registers and checklists. Then we ask, what tools do you need to fit the pipe? Will any specialized work be needed? Specialized work includes things like hot works, in which a tool is being used that could create a fire risk. Then details of how this will be managed. If cutting is needed of the pipe or other materials, what waste is accumulated and how will this be disposed of? Do you need to fill the hole once it's completed? If so, how will this be done? What materials will be used? Are they dangerous to the plumber, such as using any hazardous chemicals? Will the plumber be exposed to inhalation risks due to the materials being used? And finally, what PPE or personal protective equipment and tools are needed, and how must these be used, cleaned, and looked after? As you can see from the above questions, there is a lot to consider, even for a project that seemed at the start to be very low risk. Now, this is not to frighten you or to say that all work must be complicated and difficult, although it may seem that's what we're saying. The reason we are discussing this is to show how easy it is for something to be overlooked at the start of a project and how this can lead to injuries and potential hazards and risks for yourself as well as others around you. Even though we have only looked at one of the first 2 steps of the project, it is actually very simple to do, especially once a system is in place, where we ask these safety-related questions before any project starts. This means that we can have the information readily available before the next task, the next time we have to do the same installation. What are we trying to say? Well, it's like going to gym to get physically fit. A safety management system must be regularly used and exercised in order to become fit for the purpose of keeping everyone safe. In step number 3, we now need to perform a risk assessment. This is to determine the hazards and risks and associated control measures in order to keep everyone safe. Please remember, a risk assessment must be done by a competent, qualified risk assessor appointed in writing, and risk assessments should be performed on site. Once we have performed the risk assessment, we now need to gather the rest of the documents needed to complete a project-specific file. This will include policies, registers, checklists, procedures, or any necessary compliance documents, and this will all be our supporting documentation. You've done the risk assessment and you've got all supporting documentation. Now we need to induct and train the plumbers involved on this project, because they need to know all the safety hazards and risks as well as the full method and scope of work to keep them safe. This means that plumbers must not just sign the documents in the file, they will need to actually know and understand what the applications are and what their responsibility is. The steps that we have considered above does not need to be exhaustive. It doesn't need to be overcomplicated. In fact, it should be kept as simple as possible. You see, we don't need these thick safety files for every single job that we are doing. We need specific documentation, site-specific documentation. Often we see massive safety files coming to site, and this is almost a red flag, because what we identify with this is that it's not actually site-specific, it's just a whole lot of information to try and confuse the safety department. And we know and understand what is required for a site. For a job as simple as providing a pipe feed down to a pump or up to a pump and then to the feed pipe is relatively simple, and so only a few documentation will probably be needed for the site. Yes, it is still considered a safety file because it has all of the documentation filed into an orderly form in order for induction and training to be provided for the people on site, the employees working, as well as the plumbers doing the installation. But it doesn't have to be overly complicated. What it must be is site-specific, task-specific, and available in a form that not only helps the employee understand what the nature of risk is that they are going to be involving themselves in, but sufficient and adequate enough to keep them safe when performing that task. Remember that plumbers in specific roles of responsibilities also need to be appointed. You need to have a supervisor who will be appointed to oversee the project. You might also need to include firefighters, a scaffold team, first aiders. All of this will make up the entire safety management system or safety file that you're providing for that specific site. Now, the file should be completed and handed over for the initial audit by your client if that is the project requirements. But what if it is for just a private home? Or perhaps you will take that file back and store it so that should anything happen in the future, you have got a documented body of proof that you have kept all safe during that work. Remember, you still need to ensure what is said in the documents of the project file is actually executed correctly and in accordance with any safety procedures that are laid out.